Is Katy Jon Went, and Katy, you have been through this whole process yourself. What are you making of this landmark report, which seems quite damning of the existing policy?
Well, as you say, I've been through the whole process, but quite some time ago. And I think the report is mainly concerned about teenagers. It's not concerned about adults like me who did it in later years and took a long, long time making up their mind about it. And definitely for someone like me who felt it from a very, very young age. Indeed, Hilary Cass actually does say there is still evidence that it can be the right thing for some people who have persistently felt it from a young age. And some of the evidence on cross-sex hormones shows that it does lead to somebody having a better life and someone having reduced distress, etc. She doesn't turn around and kind of say that transgender doesn't exist. She doesn't turn around and say that gender identity, gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, whatever you want to call it, and the name changes kind of every edition of the DSM or the ICD, the classifications of diseases. She doesn't say that it doesn't exist. She does say that we need to be cautious, extremely cautious now. Perhaps that's the difference between now and the earlier version and other people's looks at this. We need to be extremely cautious when dealing with kids. Obviously, there's no actual kind of intervention with kids. What we're talking about is teenagers going through puberty and putting puberty on pause. I think the language that puberty goes on pause with puberty blockers is kind of pretty much gone for good around this. Everyone probably acknowledges that if you put a teenager on a puberty blocker,
she's not saying it doesn't exist, but she's not saying
exactly
it does exist to the extent that it has been listened to and treated so far.
No, exactly. And she rightly says that we need to look at all of the other causes and that it is a mental distress. And where there are other causes, we need to be really cautious that we're not treating some other cause with the transgender solution. And I 100% agree with that. We know that up to 3/4 of people who are going through gender distress aren't actually what we would have called transgender in the old school kind of diagnosis. The fact that we're diagnosing it younger, but then giving an adult treatment to it is where the kind of the issue is. And she's talking about the fact that there's a very kind of constructive, I see it as constructive. Many trans people won't, and I only speak for myself. I don't represent a trans community. She sees it as a very constructive approach, suggesting that this should shift to a cross-disciplinary kind of pediatric basis for this, that there should be long-term, very slow support. She uses the word unhurried, which I think is actually very sensible, what we used to talk about 10 years plus back ago was the watch and wait aspect, and it needs to be moving back to that.
And there's a sort of identity issue, or she's certainly identified in this report an issue around what she calls exceptional toxicity, that this stormy discourse, that no one can talk about it without such strong opinions, has actually let down these children so much, and particularly the role of activist charities in heaping pressure not only on the NHS but also on parents who've been led to believe if they don't deal with this imminently before their child hits puberty, they might kill themselves or they might self-harm, which is led to these decisions, rushed decisions, and huge pressure. Do you agree with that?
Actually, that's the biggest thing I do agree with. The whole polarisation, and I think she used the word stifling of debate. The biggest thing I'm known for is I believe in dialogue and debate, and it was one of the aspects when this kind of all began to be questioned and queried. Everything that you look at, particularly if you're looking at evidence-based medicine, you need to examine it, you need to test it, you need to explore it. The fact that people had PhDs blocked when they were looking to do a PhD on transition or on detransition, and the fact that 6 out of 7 of the adult gender clinics were kind of disinclined to be part of the follow-up studies of the cohort of 9,000 teenagers who kind of came through the Tavistock, went on to adult clinics, and then the adult clinics said, look, we don't want to do the studies that you want to do to see where these people are going. And the fact that there's a resistance there means we're not following up on the evidence. So even medicine is kind of scared of this polarization. Yes. And we need to be able to have these dialogues and have these debates without getting offended by it, but also without deliberately kind of causing offense by it, and actually try and do it in such a way as to maintain the humanity of the individuals involved.
Well, that's why it's great talking to you, because you're doing all of those things. Katy, could I ask you, how old are you?
I could make a joke. You should never ask a woman that question, but I'm flexible on kind of identity terminology. You can ask a person that question. I'm 57. Yeah.
Did you say 57?
Yeah, I know. Hormones are good for you. Look.
Well, I'll tell you what, yeah,
good.
absolutely well done there. That's amazing. Now, that's absolutely perfect, because that puts you in the same sort of generational loop as me. And here's what I wanted to ask you. When I was young at school and growing up as a teenager and whatever, Katy, I was not aware of this at all. People didn't come and say, you know, I'm a boy and I want to be a girl, or I'm a girl and I want to be a boy. You just didn't hear about it. Now we hear about it everywhere. So here's my question to you. Did it exist back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s? Or is this just something that has come about in the last 5, 6, 7 years?
Well, when I went to school, I didn't know anyone, but then there was no way to kind of go through a process as a teenager then. So I didn't hear about it, as it were, till I was an adult. When I went to university, there was no internet still, so you couldn't. There was no kind of social pressure. There was no kind of so-called ideological pressure. There was no TikTok pressure. None of those things existed.
Yeah.
Yet I still felt the things that I felt the distress that I felt from an early age, from around the age of 5. But if you go back through the record, you can find the people like April Ashley. You will find trans people have always existed, and people were transitioning in the 1960s and heading off to French surgeons in Morocco. You can go back to 1904 and Magnus Hirschfeld's book, The Third Sex, where he documents people like this. So people have always existed, but
like
yeah, the
Jenner.
escalation.
But they were very rare. They were very rare, Katy. That's the thing. And I'm just trying to work out, is this something that we have made in vogue or trendy? You're mentioning, you know, people going to Tunisia and whatever, but that would have been very rare, very, very rare. Does that mean there were just hundreds or hundreds of thousands of people who were trapped in the wrong bodies? Why didn't we hear about it? Why didn't people discuss it with each other?
Well, the NHS data from 20-odd years ago talked about 1 in 100,000 or 1 in... And I remember when they were talking about 1 in 100,000 people in the trans communities there, early trans activists, before the current kind of range, were talking about the fact it's not 1 in 100,000, it's more like 1 in 1,000. Yeah. Now, they're saying it's not 1 in 1,000, it's more like 1 in 50. So there's been two kind of big kind of generational...
I'm trying to work out why, because the thing is that if we get resistance and whatever from people, they'll say, oh, it wasn't like that in my day. And then you get people saying, kids saying, I want to be a cat, I want to be a pussycat, I want somebody to tickle my belly and whatever, and schools are taking this seriously, and I want a litter tray beside my desk and all this sort of thing. Where's all this come from?
I think whether it's social contagion or whether it's social media contagion, and whether it's, in other words, whether it's just a social cohort, whether it's a group going through a class, going through a school. I've worked with trans youth or youth who have gender kind of questioning. That's the other way some people prefer to put it, because, you know, you can't actually transition per se, so you can't actually really have transgender youth per se. But the numbers doing it, yes, has escalated. But there is a difference. What I'm seeing is there's a huge crossover with kind of the neurodiversity cohort, a huge crossover with everything from eating disorders to bullying to body dysmorphia to the very pressure that you get from Instagram and TikTok on how you look, and if you don't look a certain way, hey, trans is the solution, or maybe you are trans. And it was never put forward as maybe you are this, but it was instead 20 years ago, people who were under incredible distress trying everything else, and then going to a psychiatrist as a last resort instead of going to a therapist or a school kind of representative as a first resort. And I think it's that jump from last resort to first resort.
I'm sorry to rush you, but I just want to squeeze in this final point that Hilary Cass identifies in the report, which is the use of pronouns. Now, a minute ago, you said you're quite fluid on what you use, and she said that actually people have been too quick to allow their children to change their pronouns, to change their dress, to make everybody at the school address them with a different name, and that actually this all needs to be slowed down. And I wonder if that feeds into what Eamon was saying about this huge rise, because anyone who seemed to be questioning is suddenly being legitimised by adults when actually they're children and they're not really sure what they think yet, and we should be protecting them, surely, until they're much older.
Well, as was said only this week, social transition isn't a neutral act, but it isn't an entirely negative act either. Recognizing that for some people, if allowing them a degree of social transition, but saying this doesn't mean we're actually saying you are trans and you are this other person, and the social transition doesn't merit you sudden access to the opposite sex spaces within a school environment. But if someone who comes to school and they're called Samantha and says from now on I want to be called Sam, and it's not even about gender, it's just say this is my preferred name, you call them by their preferred name if it helps you get on with better classroom behavior and helps you get on with their education. But I don't think, lock, stock and barrel, full investment in you came to school on Monday morning and you say you are this and we now believe you are this. But courtesy and kind of navigating the spaces around people like that, addressing someone by name and avoiding pronouns is another way, simply doing it. But I think there has to be kind of when people are in the system and then they're getting a letter from their doctor and say this person is going through the clinics, this person prefers to be known as, and this will actually benefit their mental health, to be addressed in that way. When professionals are involved rather than someone just saying, I want to be this, there is a difference between gender dysphoria being classed as a pathology within mental health. And I know there's a shift away from the mental health pathology to it being kind of recognized as something else. But for now, if you're talking about the well-being and the mental health of kids, then look at the well-being and the mental health of the kid. What is going to help and what is going to help classroom dynamics? Not lock, stock and barrel, case-by-case decision.
Okay. Katy Jon, you're fascinating to talk to, and I would like to talk to you again in more depth on this programme. Indeed, what I'd like to do this morning is get views and comments from our listeners and viewers and put them to you if you're available live again later on this morning, because you talk with great reason there, and I think people will understand your journey, what you've been through. Your age absolutely astounds me, because you look 20 years younger. That is absolutely incredible. And it's an amazing story to tell, and your opinions on this CAS report. So thank you for your time and your explanations this morning. We'll say goodbye to you for the moment. We'll see if we can get you up again later today. Somebody will speak to you about that. Katy Jon Went, thank you very much indeed.